Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Caitlin Roper, and I'm really excited to be speaking today with Rose Hunter, a writer and prostitution survivor. Her latest book is Body Shell Girl, which is a memoir in verse that tells the story of the first 2 years of the decade she spent in the sex industry in Canada. Rose, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me and being willing to share your expertise with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
Okay, so we might get right into it. So, more and more, we're seeing prostitution being referred to as sex work and the women in the sex industry as sex workers, whether this is in academia or in media or even like government inquiries. And I think some people think that this is a more respectful way to refer to the women in the industry. And I'm wondering, as a sex industry survivor, what your thoughts are on the terms sex work and sex worker.
Yeah, so I don't use the term myself, but I know a lot of people use it in a very well-intentioned way, like you said, because they think it's a kinder term and everyone wants to reduce the stigma, or most people want to reduce the stigma that women in this industry face. And so I think a lot of people are using it with very good intentions that way. However, I don't think it's a good term to use. Firstly, because it legitimizes this industry and erases the harms of this industry too. Makes it seem like a job like any other, which from my experience, it certainly was not. And I think the more we normalize it, the more young women are going to think, well, it's okay, and get caught up in it. And that was really my story, you know. So I got into the industry after I went to university. I actually got a degree, and then well, maybe I'll tell that bit of the story later, but I got in the industry for the primary reason that most of us do, because I needed money. But I also think sort of the indoctrination that I was subject to at university played a role, which was very much sex work is a legitimate job like any other. And a lot of people said that who had never done it. And I heard that, and I think it probably played a part in my going to that first interview at a massage parlor. That I thought, well, maybe it's okay, you know. And so that's why I think the term is very harmful, because I think it serves to funnel more women into this industry, really, which is a very violent and abusive industry by nature. And we'll probably talk a bit more about that later. But yeah, so those are a few of the reasons. But um, I have been in a situation really where I've been made to use the term sex work to apply to what I went through, which really annoys me a lot. Um, it's almost like you're not allowed to use any other term for it. And me as a survivor, I'm not allowed to use, any other term for it either. And this has happened in various media articles. And so that just feels a bit awful to me, that I can't use the term that I know more accurately describes my experience, which is prostitution.
That must be incredibly invalidating as a survivor to be told you're not allowed to talk about it in the way that you understand it and that you experienced it, but you have to frame it as work rather than abuse because that's the kind of mainstream language or something. That's the acceptable way to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really quite astonishing. And I do sort of ask what other sort of marginalized group has the powers that be swoop in and say, you must use this term to describe your lived experience. I just don't see that happening with in a lot of other realms.
Mm.
So I think that's an interesting one for sure.
Mm. So, Rose, you did touch on this a little bit already, but well, I guess, sorry, going back a little bit, I think there's kind of this naive notion that if prostitution was bad for women, then they wouldn't do it. So that they wouldn't enter the industry, or if they were in the industry and it was really bad, that they would leave. So therefore, if they don't leave, it can't be all that bad, at least according to like some social media comment sections and things like that. So I was wondering if you could go back and tell us a little bit more about the circumstances in which you entered the industry and also some of the barriers to leaving.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll lead with sort of the parallel to domestic violence there. It's sort of notable to me that most people these days no longer ask, why doesn't she leave? When we talk about women in domestic violence, we understand there are pressures there, economic pressures, children, a lot of these same pressures, pressures that women in the sex industry have also. So yeah, I think it's a very strange argument in a way. So me, yeah, so how I got into it, I did my university degree in Australia, as mentioned. Just to sort of summarize, I was pretty unstable sort of person back then, to put it mildly, I guess, and really wanted to escape my life and myself, actually, really. But I thought the solution to that would be to escape to the other side of the world. So I got a year's working visa in Canada and showed up there with, no coat, wearing sneakers in the middle of winter. It was just a mess. But I did get a legit job. And then I lost that job. And then I just didn't have enough money in reserve for rent. And that's when I saw these ads in the paper, print newspaper back in those days. And I thought, I wonder what this is. And that's where I think that sort of I'm going to call it grooming that I had at university that led me to believe that this was not that bad, played a role in me showing up. So initially, I was going to do anything to remain in the country and pay my rent. That's all there was to it. So I think I don't know if I really I was really very out of touch with my own experiences. So I don't know how much of any of it I felt. I definitely thought it was sort of very silly and bizarre and just this sort of a very, very strange world. And I was just very cut off from my own body. So people that I didn't want touching me did not seem that strange. I just thought, well, I get paid for it, so it's okay, and I definitely see that attitude a lot. If you get paid, it's sort of okay. And it took me a long time to question that and question, where did that come from? Why did I think it was okay to be abused, essentially, if I got paid? But in terms of wanting to leave and not getting out, which I think was your original question. Sorry for the
Oh,
preamble. Um, I've described it before as sort of it's a vicious circle for sure. And it's just this toxic mix of factors, and every step you take takes you further into the quicksand. In my case, I had addiction and alcoholism problems. And so I had all these other things that were preventing me from being a normal sort of functional member of society and getting a normal job. I actually left many times. I just couldn't stay stopped. I got other jobs and then I lost them through my own unreliability. And here was a job that I could always have, regardless of how unreliable I was. It didn't matter. And after a while, it came to seem like all that I was able to do in life. And so I felt very grateful for the work, actually, because I thought, well, that's all I'm able to do. And so it's really a matter of settling. And if it's the violence and all the other things. And I'm talking about the everyday casual violence. I'm not talking about the specifically, obviously violent episodes. I'm talking about the way being constantly groped by your average sex buyer is violent, not, you know, uh, the other things which happen as well. Um, so yeah, I think I lost my thread with what I was saying a little bit, but maybe you can
No,
distill
that's
something out of that.
yeah, that's all really helpful. Thank you. I think my next question, well, I actually have a few questions about some of the myths and misconceptions about the sex trade, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. So the first one, again, we've sort of touched on it already because there's everything's really quite intertwined, but this notion that women choose it, with the implication being that women are responsible for the abuse done to them by men, or like, because they chose it or consented to it, or that again, it couldn't be that bad because women choose it. So I'm wondering what's your response to women choose it as a defense?
Right. Well, I would ask immediately, why are they choosing it? Because not all women choose it. And, according to the research, it does tend to be a certain, not type, but situation that a woman's in that makes her choose this. So it's not a free choice. It's usually, I mean, most of us immediately, it's the money. I mean, so there's not too many rich women choosing it, for starters. Or if they do, it's in a very limited way where they get to pick and choose things, and it's just a bit of an adventure. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about women who are actually in the industry because they need the money. So that's the first thing. And, the second reason women often choose it is addiction issues like I had, alcoholism, that make it difficult to keep another job. Another reason women choose it is because of past abuse, which sort of makes what's happening seem just normal, you know. And I would say also another reason women choose it is because of the way women are indoctrinated in our culture to self-objectify. And so it's doesn't seem like that much of a stretch. And I think you see this happening increasingly with platforms like OnlyFans and what have you. So when you look at the reasons why women are choosing it, none of those are good reasons. They're not choosing it because it's a good career, or because it will really get them somewhere in life, because for most of us, it doesn't. It does the extreme opposite. Most of us leave the industry with less than we came in, and it's in the end a contributor to more poverty, as well as more trauma and all the rest of it. So yeah, I think when we talk about choice, it's important to ask, why is this person choosing it? Why is the woman choosing to stay in the domestic violence situation? Again, I think it's a good parallel. It's not actually because she says, "Yeah, I want to be here." It's a very pressurized choice. And Sheila Jeffreys, it calls it a decision rather than a choice. It's like there's all these shit options, and so you choose one of the shit options, and that's the sex industry in many cases. So it's not this free choice that people think it is. And I think it's confusing for people too, because a lot of women, and I think we're going to talk about Lily Phillips later, will say they love it and they're choosing it, but you've got to put that into some perspective. That's the accepted porn script that we're supposed to say. I mean, I said it all the time, so that sort of thing is not necessarily the truth at all. Yeah, so those are a few ideas.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, and I think you make the point really well that the women who are supposedly choosing the sex trade are women who are profoundly vulnerable, who are marginalized and all these things. But again, this concept, I like what you said about Sheila Jeffries, the point about it being a decision, because when you think of a choice, the term choice suggests that there's actual viable options. You're choosing between more than one, excuse me, viable options. And if your options are to be in the sex industry or to not eat and not pay the rent, that's not much of a choice. You might not be choosing from, like, oh, I could have a career as a lawyer or a doctor, or I could be in the sex trade. It's not that kind of choice. It's very limited options and constrained choices, which is why the term choice is kind of not not the best applied to this situation. But the next thing I wanted to ask you about, so this is one of my personal favorite arguments, and I'm being really sarcastic in defense of the sex trade, is, but some women find it empowering. So we expose how women are harmed through commercial sexual exploitation, and someone will come out and respond claiming that men's paid sexual access to women's bodies is empowering for women. And I'm just like, what do you think empowering means? Like, what meaningful power or change in real world conditions do women get from being objectified, from being sexually used and abused by men? And how is this actually advancing the status of women? It's almost become like a buzzword now. Something's branded empowering, or the defense is pulled out, oh, but some women find it empowering, or some women like it. And like, oh, all critical analysis must stop right there. So it's like this way of shutting down all the discussion of how women are harmed. So I'm wondering how you, as a survivor, would respond to this claim or this defense of the sex trade that some women find it empowering.
Right. Well, it wasn't empowering in my case. I can say that off the top. But I sometimes joke that I was tipped extra for saying it was empowering, because a lot of sex buyers like to hear that. Um, in the beginning, I did think it was empowering for one reason, which was money. I could pay my rent, which in an immediate sense, I suppose, was empowering rather than the alternative of not being able to pay my rent. Um, Over the long term, it was extremely disempowering. As I mentioned, I had great difficulty doing this work, unacceptable work, sober. So I drank a lot, and alcoholism was one of the costs for me, which was not remotely empowering. And then not being able to get out of the industry, that sort of quicksand thing, which was very disempowering. And, to fast forward, in the end, 10 years later, I left with nothing, just addiction, alcoholism, accumulated trauma, and a big hole in my resume for the last 10 years. So all of that, and I'm not unusual in that way from what I observed working with other women. So all that's very disempowering. So it seems like the empowering thing applies to a woman clutching some shiny banknotes that she got in the moment, which is a very momentary thing and doesn't take into account any of the future consequences that, as we know from the research, happen to women in this industry. So, and in a broader sense, I think, and someone made a comment on this recently, which I thought was great. I think there's a sense in which women, I remember doing this, looking around and as a woman in my mid-20s in Canada, I got harassed a lot. And I remember one episode which was sort of always burned in my mind. I was on the bus and I just felt this pressure on my back, and looked around eventually, and this guy's got his dick out and he's rubbing it, on my new coat. And I included that in my book, actually, and I got off the bus. This sort of thing accumulated day after day, and I thought I may as well get paid. And I think that's what these women are referring to when they mean that they find it empowering. It's happening anyway, so let's just get paid. And that's sort of the argument I see a lot with women who are in favor of this industry is, yeah, society's terrible, it's objectifying, all of this, so let me get paid for it. And honestly, I understand that attitude because it was my attitude for quite some time. But then I came to see over the long term, getting paid in the short term um, had bad consequences for me in the long term. And then, of course, as you mentioned, it doesn't advance the position of women at all. And it's all about getting mine. And who cares about other women, you know? And that, I think, is a big problem with arguments for the sex industry that say that this woman finds it empowering. I mean, there's not a lot of women who are on a subsistence level in the sex industry who will say that. So it's the more exceptional women who maybe have other options, who can sort of be a tourist in this industry for a while, and they tend to get their newspaper articles written about them and whatnot. And then they can say it's empowering, and they're really doing a disservice to the grand majority of the women in this industry that it's not empowering for at all. But it doesn't seem to matter at the moment, as long as it's just such an individualistic attitude that if I got paid and if I felt empowered in the moment, then it was empowering. So I think, as you say, let's define what empowering actually is, rather than just bandying it around, because it's when you dig about like a millimeter deep, it doesn't make any sense.
And that's a really important point you raise about whose voices we're actually hearing. I know, most days it seems you go into the mainstream media, things like news.com.au or other big news sites, and there's these puff pieces all about women, how much, they're earning so much money on OnlyFans or in the sex industry, excuse me, and they're all talking about how empowering it is. And these are the voices we're hearing all the time. The tiny minority, the women at the top who are the most privileged and have the most options, and how well they're doing, which, again, is questionable. But we're not hearing the voices from the vast majority of women in the sex trade who are vulnerable, who are marginalized, who are being harmed. So we actually, last year, no, 2 years ago, I think, Collective Shout, we partnered with CATWA, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, and we completed a report called Side Hustles and Sexual Exploitation. And it was a research project on how the Australian media reported on the sex industry during the first year of the COVID pandemic. And, what we found was just really quite staggering, in terms of the blatant promotion of the sex industry as a viable, desirable, glamorous career option for young women. And we analysed, I think it was 11 different mainstream news sources. And yeah, anyone who's interested, please check it out. It's on our website and on CATWA's website. But it's a really fascinating report. So moving on. So the next question I wanted to ask is, we often hear that prostitution and sex trafficking are completely separate and distinct. So that on the one hand, trafficking is forced and then prostitution is freely chosen. So they're like these separate things that don't really have anything to do with each other. And, this idea that prostitution is chosen and it's separate and distinct from trafficking, the conclusion sort of being, therefore, that's not really harmful. So I'm wondering what you make of that.
Yeah, I mean, when I was sort of newer to thinking more deeply about this topic, I always used to start my story in that way, like I wasn't underage, I wasn't trafficked, and it was very important for me to sort of say that. Now I don't know, partially whether it was sort of a minimizing sort of tool as well, that I still like to tell myself, well, it wasn't that bad, which is sort of just a sign of trauma, really, that we tend to minimize. But I think the distinction is useful in some ways, in that there are women who, have been brought into it by physical coercion, had their passports confiscated, etc., etc. But when you sort of look at it more broadly, you can look at the different kinds of coercion that go on. And I would say that I was coerced in different ways, in much less obvious and much more insidious ways. And we've talked about a few of those already, like the culture that told me this is a viable option. And you just talked about the Australian media telling women that, so there's other kinds of coercion that go on like that. So I think it's it's either a continuum. I think maybe a continuum is one way to think of it, rather than trafficking's over here and prostitution is over here, because they're definitely related. And of course, the other thing is that a lot of trafficking happens in brothels, where people like me, who, as I say, wasn't trafficked, work, so we're in the same sorts of places. The sex buyers don't care either way, whether they're seeing a trafficked woman or not. So it's all happening in the same industry. Yeah, those are a few thoughts.
Thank you. Moving on to my next question. So towards the end of last year, we published a blog post reflecting on OnlyFans model Lily Phillips and her quest to have sex with 100 men in 24 hours. You might recall there was a clip from a documentary about it that went viral, showing Lily in the aftermath, and she's quite visibly shaken and blinking back tears. And a lot of viewers dismissed the obvious harm to her on the basis that she chose to participate. And some even defended the men who lined up to take turns and use her body because she chose it and that made it like okay or permissible somehow. So we obviously saw it as a bit more complicated than that, and that 100 opportunistic men essentially lined up to participate in a young woman's act of self-harm. Now, we quoted you in that blog from a speech that you had given, I think, last year, where you talked about how you perceived your situation at the time you were in the sex trade as opposed to after you had left it. So as you've watched all this unfold and seen the public response to it, I'm wondering what you think about it all.
Yeah, gosh, yeah, and I really liked your take on that issue too. And so I have so many things to say about this. It's difficult to know where to start. Firstly, it really took me back to my own experiences in sort of a dark way, in that I remembered, the most men in one night who had ran through me, as she put it. She talked about these, 100 men who are going to run through me. And, the number was nothing like Lily's number, but I remember how I felt at the end of that, which was just like a piece of garbage. Like the image I had was just put me by the side of the road and just have a garbage truck come pick me up. That's how I felt. So I just imagined, how she felt. And the whole situation reminded me a lot of how things proceed in a brothel. Like in the full documentary, they each come in and she says, "Oh, let me take your coat," and she asks them some sort of inane question or whatever, I mean, they only had 5 minutes each with her, so not as much. But the whole routine was, I thought, oh, this is brothel work when I was watching the documentary. So I think I'm getting a little bit off track. Why is she saying it's empowering? Well, she's making a lot of money from it, which, as we've seen, is the idea that harms are removed. Yeah, I thought that someone made a very astute comment on Facebook to the effect that She will deny her own trauma, I think was the quote, which is, of course, what happened, because afterwards she said she's going to do it again with a lot more men, etc., etc. And the commenter went on to say, we'll hear from her in 30 years as to what it actually meant, you know. And that was really interesting for me. For me, it took me about 25, so I thought that's about right. And I could really relate to that, denying your own trauma. And again, I think you have to look at why is someone doing that, you know. I can't say what Lily's been through in her 23 years that makes her say, like she did in the documentary, that I'm just good for one thing or something like that, that she says. But I can say that in my case, with my very similar attitude to hers, it came from a place of abuse. It came from a place of being told that I was no good, being told I was stupid, and a deep belief that I didn't have much to offer the world at all. So if I got paid for my body, that's what I can do, you know? And so the trauma didn't matter, you know? I was getting validated in another way. So I was able to block out the physical reality of what was happening. And I think you saw that in some of her comments too, where she said I've forgotten, but she said something about some signs of dissociation during, you know, just cutting herself off from the experience, not being there at all, and just getting through it. And why? For the money, for the notoriety, and all these things. But I think you'd have to ask deeper questions as to why, which only, you know, she and her immediate family would know. But I would bet that there would be some deeper issues going on there.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. I think as well, it's almost like once you've announced that you're doing this thing, even if this cracks start to form, like, oh, maybe this is not a good idea, maybe I don't want to do that. Like, it's almost like you have to dig in your heels hard and be like, no, no, I insist. Like, I love this, I choose it, I want to do it. And because I suppose to admit that you are being harmed by it, I don't think you could continue. I don't think she could actually continue doing what she's doing and being in that space while also acknowledging the reality of the situation. So I think it's almost necessary to kind of cling to that belief. No, no, I want this, I choose it, rather than to see how you are actually being harmed. And I suspect, like you said, down the track, years from now, maybe that's when when she's out of the situation, that she might be able to look at back and see things a little bit differently.
I think I might just pick up on what you said about, well, I say it's empowering, I say it's my choice because it makes me feel better. I mean, I think that's a very true analysis, and I tried that on myself at times during the industry, although even back then I thought empowerment was a stretch, but I can see the appeal of that, and I can understand how women, people, anyone in abusive situation would want to do that. It's probably common across abuse situations. But in particular, in the case of being objectified and then turning around and saying that that objectification is your own empowerment, and it's empowering because I say it is, you know, not for maybe any deep reasons. I think that yeah, it seems to be very prevalent, and it seems to me sort of a sort of desperation response to the extent in which women are still, you know, objectified in society. And if we can't change it, let's just cash in on it, and let's just say we're empowered and that's it, you know. Obviously, I think that's not the response that we need to be doing. and there's nothing in that that's going to change anything. I did hear, I was listening to a podcast with some women discussing this who are sort of mainstream feminists, and one of them said that Lily Phillips was actually talking on some other clip, which I haven't seen, so it's second hand, but this is what she said, that Lily Phillips had said that she realizes her channel is quite harming for other women because of some of the things that she does. And then men turn around and they want their girlfriends to do these sorts of things, you know. And the woman on the podcast said, yeah, but she's not responsible for any of those other people. And I thought, that's the problem I see with mainstream liberal feminism at the moment, because what is feminism if it's not being responsible for other people, specifically women? You know, but again, there was that attitude that it's just about individual women getting theirs, and good for them if they get ahead, and however they do it. And so to me, that's capitalism, but it's not feminism at all. You know, so that was another thing that struck me in some of the responses as well.
And also notably absent from a lot of these discussions, the role of the men who participate, who profit, who do all of this, like the men who chose to line up to take turns using a woman one after the other. And, you know, the whole conversation is all about Lily. And I understand, obviously, because we're asking the question, why would a woman make the decision to do this? What's going on there? But then it's the focus, as always, is on the women and are they choosing it? And let's talk about their choices rather than let's look at the men's choices. Why are they choosing to participate? Why are they choosing to inflict harm on a woman just for their own sexual gratification or entertainment or enjoyment? Like, these are the discussions we need to be having. The role of men in driving the sex trade, in perpetuating and profiting and participating in the objectification of women.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing back that focus. Yeah, I mean, I think as you pointed out and other people have pointed out, if those 100 men didn't show up, couldn't have happened. You know, the industry couldn't happen. So yeah, it is correctly where we should put our focus. And on the self-harming, you know, there's all kinds of other analogies like domestic violence again. I was in domestic violence for a while as well, and I remember saying to my partner, you know, hit me, because I'd had it, you know. Was that me saying, oh, it's my choice, so it's okay that he hit me, you know?
Rose, you wrote a really excellent piece last year that was published by the ABC, arguing for the need to listen to survivors when it comes to legislative approaches to the sex trade. I was wondering if you can tell us what you think the best legislative model for prostitution is.
Yeah, so I think it's the Nordic model is the best approach. And for those who don't know, the Nordic model does not criminalize the women, which is something that a lot of people who are very well-meaning get very worried about. So we don't criminalize the women in the Nordic model, but we criminalize the men. So that's why they call it an asymmetrical model. Um, so yeah, I think it's the best model because it speaks to the harms of the industry. You know, it speaks to the fact that the vast majority of women aren't doing this for millions of dollars like Lily Phillips. They're in some I think Lily Phillips is probably in some psychologically bad terrain, but these women are in some very materially bad terrain. And so there's exploitation going on. And so the men are the ones who should bear the burden of any punishment, but the model really isn't about punishing anyone. The aim is to reduce demand.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. As you point out, It's an asymmetrical model because what it does is it recognizes that prostitution is, that it is a form of men's violence against women and girls, and that it is driven by male demand. So if men weren't buying women and girls for sexual exploitation, then this industry, this thriving industry, would cease to exist. So that's where, as you said, it decriminalizes the women because it understands that these women are essentially victims of violence by the buyers, by the men, by this system. And so it says they're not actually committing any crime, they're not doing anything wrong, but recognizing that the men who drive it, that they are the ones who are perpetrating this violence against women and fueling the demand. And something else I think is really important about the Nordic model is helping women to exit the industry. I wonder if you know any more about that element that you could tell us.
Yeah, that's a really key element. Thanks for adding that. Yeah, I mean, that part of the model means a lot to me personally, because, in all my years in the industry, mostly what I heard was this mainstream, on the left anyway, sex work ideology, where I was choosing this and it was all fine. And I never saw anything like an exit service, and I often wonder how my life could have changed if I had, if I'd seen the idea at all that oh, perhaps my life is such a mess because of this industry. Because in my mind, my life was such a mess because I just couldn't get it together and I was stupid and all this. It was all my personal responsibility. And the industry didn't have anything to do with it because the industry was just fine, nothing to see here. I was totally gaslit by the idea, denied my own trauma, like we were talking about earlier. And yeah, it just would have made such a difference to me to see the opposite opinion expressed somewhere, and particularly on the left, that this industry is maybe, not a very healthy industry to be in. And either way, here's someone who's going to help you exit if you want to, right? It doesn't have any consequence. Anyone who wants to stay in the industry, exit services doesn't affect them. But to make these services available to people who might just go, oh, okay, maybe I'll give it a go. And, it might not happen immediately, might be one of those seeds that gets planted, and then years later you come back to it and think, oh, I remember there was that exit, so maybe I'll give that another try. Because we know through my experience, and research has shown also, that women often take many years to successfully exit, even when they really want to exit. Yeah, that part of the Nordic model means a lot to me too.
Mm. And also the point that I guess when prostitution is framed as sex work, so it's about work or labor, if prostitution is just a job like any other, then there's no need for exit programs, right? Like if you're a hairdresser, no one needs an exit program to get out of hairdressing. But that's one of the problems when you frame it as a form of labor rather than seeing it as abuse and exploitation, because then we're not talking about exit programs and pathways for women to get out of the industry as well.
Yeah, and it's such a curious thing that anyone could seriously argue that hairdressing and the sex industry are remotely similar, and therefore, we don't need exit services for women in the sex industry. When I hear arguments like that, I just think common sense has completely left the building. I mean, I've been told by women, sadly, about my experience, because people do like to tell me about my experience sometimes. That, oh, I imagine being in the industry would be like working in Coles, another version of the hairdresser, And I just thought, have a think about what you just said. Have a think about what working in Coles involves, and have a think about what working in a brothel or massage parlor involves. And just have a think, I mean, seriously. Yeah, yeah. I think why that happens, though, is because this gets, it particularly happens in universities, is it all goes into some realm of theory, and we lose touch with the fact that there are real women in this industry. Um, and that sort of doesn't seem important anymore. It seems more important that the theory works, you know, and
Mm.
it sort of loses sight of real women. Yeah.
Mm. No, I think you're absolutely right, Rose. I want to come now to your book. We see it nicely. Body Shell Girl. This is an amazing book. So this one is published by Spinifex Press, and Spinifex Press actually also published my book and published six of our collective shout movement directors, Melinda Tankard Reese, six of her books as well. And they're also one of our corporate pledge partners. So anyone watching, definitely check them out. They've got lots of great books on these topics. Rose, this book is such a profoundly moving book. You write so beautifully, and you have this ability to just evoke so much feeling. I know as I read all the different poems, I would just, like, I don't know how you were able to write so well in such a way that just conveyed so much that I really felt, I guess, the emotions that, sorry, I'm not being very articulate, which is ironic because we're talking about how articulate you are. But it was so powerful, Rose. What was it like to write this book?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for those very kind comments and your support of my book as well. Um, that book took me many, many years to write. I had various earlier attempts at it, and I was just never able to write about that experience. And I just didn't know why. Because it took me a long time after getting out of the industry, which I did in 2008, to understand what it even was. You know, even when I started writing that book, I still was under some of the beliefs that some of the myths that we've been debunking today. You know, I thought it was my choice. I thought that anything that happened was my fault because I chose it, you know. Um, and maybe I just, didn't do it well enough. That's why I had all these negative effects. And, I just had all these sort of toxic ideas about it. So I never knew how to approach it. And I also didn't want it to be sort of titillating book, you know. So it was really hard. It was really hard to do. And then I think I took many years break from it and eventually came back to it. Um, but yeah, most of the poems concern, a single sex buyer, I guess, or a lot of them do, single interaction. Um, and one of the things I was interested in exploring, like, I don't actually believe all those men are bad guys or anything like that. Um, I think a lot of them haven't really thought about it, and they're just taking advantage of the privileges that they have in society, and they're taking advantage of sex work ideology, which says all this is just fine. And they're taking advantage of the fact that I said it was just fine, or told them that I was empowered if they wanted to hear it, you know. And so I was interested in that dynamic and what went on in that half an hour, or, mostly half an hour session. And I guess, in retrospect, I was probably trying to get to how it felt, because at the time I didn't feel it, any of it, in a way, uh, yeah, I was just so far dissociated from it. It was almost like I wasn't there. So I felt like in writing that book, I was there for the first time, which actually was quite painful, as you can imagine. And then into the writing was really, in one of the drafts is really when I realized this doesn't sound like what I thought it was. This doesn't sound, what I'm writing doesn't fit with this narrative that I've always carried about that experience. So it was really an interesting process. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a very profound book. And actually, one thread I just want to pick up there, you mentioned a lot of things, but one thing that stood out to me was this idea that if you are in the sex trade and you're not doing well, that's almost framed as like an individual failing. it's like, oh, so you're just not cut out for sex work, or you just didn't have what it takes, or something. That's the response I've seen to sex trade survivors on social media when they talk about the reality of their experiences and how they were harmed. It's sort of portrayed as this individual failing that you just weren't able to hack it or something. And I just feel like that's so, I don't know, it almost feels like another form of abuse and just so delegitimizing. It's like, oh, you just weren't tough enough to tolerate being sexually abused by man after man for years.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that comment. I mean, yeah, I knew I wasn't cut out for this work. Like I was not cut out for it all, but I wasn't doing it because I was cut out for it. I was doing it for the money, and in a secondary way, of course, I was cut out perfectly for it, coming from a background of abuse and the ability to just take abuse and dissociate away from it and say that it was all okay. So in a way, I was cut out for it in that way.
Just before we wrap up, I was just going to say, can you tell any of our supporters where they can find you on socials or find your work? I will actually link to all of this as well so people can find, but just, yeah, how people can sort of support you or follow your work or anything like that.
Yeah, so you mentioned the wonderful Spinifex Press. So I second all the wonderful things you said about them. So they have a website where you can find my book and Caitlin's book and Melinda's book as well, books plural. And yeah, another article that you could check out if you were interested in knowing more about the Nordic model and my survivor's perspective would be my article at the ABC, which I think you'll link here. And that sort of seeks to, yeah, just set out my reasons that I'm in favour of it. Mhm.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Rose. I think I've learned a lot. It's been really helpful to hash out some of these different topics, and I'm sure that our supporters who are watching as well, they've learned a lot as well. So thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm such a big admirer of your work and Collective Shout's work, so it's really an honour to be talking to you today.
Thanks, Rose.